Tonight, before we dive into the details, I want you to picture something extraordinary, something dramatic, unsettling, and entirely fictional, yet rooted in the fault lines of real history. Imagine turning on the news and seeing a headline so explosive, so unimaginable, that for a moment you wonder if you're reading some alternate timeline. Civil war erupts in Russia. Miners who ended USSR now target Putin as industry bankrupting. Imagine a moment in history when the ground beneath an empire does not crack from foreign invasion or political intrigue, but from the determined footsteps of its own workers, men and women emerging from miles beneath the earth to demand that their voices be heard. That is the powerful historical echo at the center of this idea the miners who once helped weaken the Soviet Union are, in this fictional scenario, rising again. Reminding the world that the most transformative political movements often begin far from the halls of government and deep within the labor force that keeps a nation running. To understand the weight of this, we must remember what those miners represented decades ago. In the late 1980s, when the USSR appeared unshakable on the surface, coal miners, exhausted, overlooked, and pushed past their limits, refused to stay silent any longer. Their strikes were not dramatic in the traditional sense. They did not wield weapons. They did not march under revolutionary flags. Instead, they placed their helmets on the ground, walked out of the shafts, and said enough. That single act of defiance reverberated across the Soviet republics, shaking a government that had long relied on discipline, control, and the silence of its workers. What made those miners so influential was not merely their numbers, but their symbolic power. They were the backbone of Soviet industry, the invisible force that powered cities, fueled factories, and sustained the state's ambitions. When they stopped, the country felt it instantly. And when they spoke, their courage cracked open conversations that had been suppressed for decades, conversations about fairness, corruption, and the right of ordinary citizens to demand a government that serves them rather than suppresses them. Now, in this imagined contemporary scenario, that same legacy reawakens. Picture a Russia where mining towns are battered by years of economic mismanagement, where wages arrive months late, where the mines that once sustained entire regions are hollowed out by bankruptcy and neglect. Families struggle, communities wither, and the government's promises feel increasingly distant. Against this backdrop, the echoes of their ancestors' defiance begin to stir. The miners, long accustomed to hardship but not accustomed to injustice, recognize the pattern, a powerful state growing more distant from its people. Leadership prioritizing control over compassion, and a widening gulf between those who govern and those who endure the consequences of that governance. That recognition becomes a spark. And just as it happened decades earlier, the spark spreads. What makes this fictional uprising even more compelling is the way it reframes political power. While modern Russia, under its current leadership, projects strength through its military, its intelligence networks, and its tightly managed political system, none of those pillars can fully withstand the pressure of a population that refuses to labor under silence any longer. The miners, with their history of shaping national outcomes, become the symbol of a deeper truth, that the most durable shifts in political landscapes often come not from elites, but from ordinary citizens who finally decide that stability without dignity is no stability at all. The emotional pull of this moment is undeniable. These workers are not driven by ideological battles or geopolitical ambitions. They are driven by the same fundamental demands their predecessors voiced to be seen, to be respected, to have a future worth handing to their children. Their emergence onto the political stage is not planned, not orchestrated by opposition parties, not manipulated by external forces. It is simply the unintentional but powerful movement of people who have been pushed too far. And in the dramatic tension of this fictional scenario lies a profound hook. What happens when the very workers who helped dismantle one authoritarian state find themselves facing another? What happens when the people most familiar with the weight of a collapsing system realize that history might be repeating itself, and that they may once again be the ones who must stop it? This is not just an echo of history. It is a reminder of how cyclical power can be, how quickly the strong can falter when they forget the value of those who labor beneath them, and how the courage of everyday people has the potential to shape political destinies far beyond the borders of their towns or the walls of their minds. The real breaking point in this fictional scenario emerges not from ideology, not from political maneuvering, but from something far more devastating and far more recognizable across the world: the slow, grinding collapse of an economy that was once the lifeline of millions. When an industry begins to rot from the inside, when wages arrive late, when mines shut down without warning, when entire towns watch their only source of stability dry up, people do not simply adapt, they fracture. And in this imagined Russia, That fracture becomes the fault line upon which national unrest erupts. The miners, already carrying the weight of a dangerous profession, suddenly find themselves carrying a second burden, the collapse of the very system that once depended on their labor. Picture a family waiting for a paycheck that never comes, a town once alive with the sound of machinery now reduced to silence, and workers standing at the entrance of abandoned shafts, wondering how a nation that proudly claims strength could let its own backbone crumble. This economic decline does not arrive like a storm. It arrives like a leak in the ceiling, slow, ignored, and steadily destructive. Eventually, the entire roof caves in, and that collapse becomes the spark for something larger. What makes this fictional economic crisis so politically explosive is not just the loss of income, but the insult embedded within that loss. The state continues projecting power, continues funding military ventures, continues rewarding elites who orbit the center of authority, while the laborers who make the country's engine run are left to negotiate with empty promises and accumulating debt. Their suffering is not collateral damage. It feels like a direct betrayal. And betrayal is one of the most volatile forces in any political system. That is where the emotional hook takes hold the moment when workers realize that their loyalty has been taken for granted, their sacrifice is minimized, their futures mortgaged to sustain a system that no longer supports them. Economic collapse becomes more than a financial crisis. It becomes a moral indictment. The miners, who once accepted hardship as part of their profession, now see hardship weaponized against them. When an industry collapses, it is not only wages that disappear, schools close. Local businesses die, medical facilities lose funding. Communities that once felt interwoven begin to unravel under the pressure of hopelessness. In this fictional scenario, these ripple effects accumulate until the people who once kept their heads down can no longer remain silent. There is a tipping point in every society where economic desperation transforms into political resolve. That point arrives when people recognize that the crisis is not temporary and not accidental and not shared equally. It arrives when the pain they experience is met not with empathy, but with indifference from the very leaders who claim to defend them. And when citizens feel abandoned, they do not simply protest, they transform. In this imagined Russia, the transformation begins quietly. Whispered frustrations in mine shafts. Small gatherings at community centers, workers meeting after shifts to compare their unpaid wages, their unfulfilled contracts, their broken expectations. But soon, the whispers turn into demands, and the demands turn into action. The economic collapse creates something the government did not anticipate, unity forged in hardship, a solidarity born from the shared realization that nothing will improve unless they force it to. The miners do not rise because they want conflict. They rise because they have been pushed into a corner where survival demands resistance. And here lies the deeper hook. How long can a government ignore the cries of its own people before those cries become a force strong enough to shake the foundations of power? Economic decline, in this fictional scenario, becomes the great equalizer, an undeniable truth that no propaganda can soften and no official narrative can bury. It exposes the cracks in governance, the disconnect between leadership and labor, and the dangerous assumption that a nation can remain stable while its workers starve. It reveals that even the most tightly controlled political systems are fragile when the hands that built them refuse to keep supporting them. This is the point where the economy stops being a number in a report and becomes a rallying cry. This is where miners, already hardened by years underground, discover an entirely new kind of strength above ground, the strength to challenge not just the collapse of their industry, but the collapse of the promises that were supposed to protect them. In this fictional scenario, the moment the miners rise is the moment Vladimir Putin's long-cultivated image of unshakable authority begins to fracture, not because of foreign pressure or elite political intrigue, but because of the one challenge no strongman regime ever fully prepares for, the unified outrage of ordinary citizens who refuse to stay silent any longer. For decades, Putin has built a reputation as a leader immune to dissent, bolstered by state-controlled messaging, a loyal security apparatus, and a carefully constructed narrative of stability. Yet even the most fortified political figure stands vulnerable when the people whose labor fuels the nation decide that fear has outlived its usefulness. It is here, at this collision point between authoritarian control and collective desperation, that the story becomes electrifying. There is an undeniable hook in watching a system that prides itself on dominance confront the one force it cannot fully suppress, the sheer determination of its working class. When miners, the very workers who once helped dismantle the Soviet state, direct their anger toward the Kremlin, the symbolism becomes impossible to ignore. These are not activists trained for the political battlefield. These are not opposition figures groomed for revolution. These are citizens defined by hard labor, by resilience, by the deeply rooted expectation that their loyalty would be repaid with at least the minimum promise of survival. When that promise breaks, A, the shockwaves reach all the way to the center of power. Putin's authority in this imagined crisis is challenged not through ideology, but through the raw. A, undeniable visibility of suffering. Television pictures of miners marching through once silent streets, towns gathering in crowds larger than any state, approved rally. A, and families hoisting signs demanding dignity become the kind of imagery no government, no matter how controlled its media environment, can fully erase. The visual weight of workers refusing to return underground becomes a political reality the Kremlin cannot easily swallow. And when miners organize, A, it sends a message across the nation. If they can stand up, anyone can. That psychological shift, where fear moves from the citizens to the leadership, is the crack in the armor that authoritarian systems dread. The tension grows sharper when the state attempts the predictable responses, dismissing the protests as isolated incidents, blaming foreign actors, deploying police in the hope that intimidation will dissolve the unrest. But in this fictional scenario, those tactics only inflame the movement further. Miners who have spent decades enduring physical danger, economic hardship, and occupational risk are not easily frightened by riot shields. Their courage becomes contagious. Each bait and swing, each attempt at suppression, each official statement denying the crisis becomes a spark that brings more citizens into the streets. And the government begins to feel something it has not experienced in years: uncertainty. The fictional conflict deepens as the Kremlin recognizes that the miners are not simply protesting, they are exposing the government's weakest point: its dependence on projecting invincibility. For years, Putin's authority has thrived on the perception that opponents cannot gain momentum, that dissent will always be isolated, that resistance will never reach critical mass. But the miners disrupt that narrative by uniting across regions, industries, and backgrounds. They do not merely challenge the state, they challenge the mythology of the state. And once that mythology begins to unravel, even small acts of defiance elsewhere become amplified. Teachers join marches. Truck drivers block highways. Retired workers return to the streets for the first time in decades. What began as an economic grievance evolves into a national confrontation with the very structure of power. The emotional power of this moment lies in its simplicity. The people kept the country running now demand to be heard. And for the first time in a long time, the leadership cannot ignore them without risking further collapse. The Kremlin, accustomed to controlling the tempo of national discourse, suddenly finds itself reacting instead of dictating. Every decision becomes a gamble. Too soft, and the uprising grows. Too harsh, and the risk of full-scale rebellion multiplies. The delicate balance of authority becomes a tightrope stretched thin across a widening canyon of public anger. What makes this fictional scenario so compelling is not just the challenge to Putin's dominance, but the revelation that real power has always resided with the people. Even when they forget it. When miners, workers defined by grit rather than politics, stand up and say, no more, they awaken something larger than themselves. Their defiance becomes a mirror reflecting the cracks in the system, and suddenly, the person who once appeared untouchable looks startlingly small against the backdrop of a nation discovering its own voice. The hook that pulls the reader deeper into this moment is the undeniable irony. A leader who built his reign on the promise of stability now faces the greatest threat to that stability from the very citizens whose labor made his version of Russia possible. In this fictional scenario, the widening gap between the elites protected by the state and the workers abandoned by it becomes the silent accelerant that turns unrest into a nationwide eruption, revealing that inequality is not merely a social issue, but a political fault line waiting to split open. At first, the divide appears like many others in modern societies, slow, creeping almost invisible. But inequality has a way of sharpening itself in moments of crisis, becoming impossible to ignore once ordinary citizens realize that they are not just struggling, but being systematically left behind. The miners feel this disparity most brutally when they watch government officials boast about national strength while their own communities drink contaminated water. Their wages arrive months late, and their towns fade into economic darkness. That contrast becomes a moral provocation, a question that refuses to disappear. How can a state claim to defend its people when those people cannot afford to survive? The moment that question begins echoing, and not just in households, but in streets, unions, and public squares, inequality transforms from discomfort into confrontation. And that confrontation becomes the hook that pulls the entire country into a reckoning it can no longer avoid. In this imagined Russia, the government's attempts to mask the disparities only highlight them further. Lavish state projects, televised military parades, and the opulence of wealthy oligarchs serve as visual reminders of everything the miners no longer have. Every display of luxury becomes an insult. Every ribbon-cutting ceremony for elite developments feels like a statement that some citizens matter and others do not. And when people sense that their suffering is a direct byproduct of someone else's comfort, resentment becomes more than an emotion. It becomes a force. That force gathers momentum each time a worker hears an official promise improvement while staring at an empty paycheck. The contradiction between public narrative and lived reality becomes stark. That trust is not merely shaken, it is obliterated. This is where the fictional unrest deepens, because inequality is not passive, it hardens, it spreads. It changes how people see their leaders and how they see themselves within a system that has decided their value is expendable. What makes this moment particularly volatile is the way inequality builds alliances among citizens who previously believed their struggles were isolated. Miners see their plight mirrored in teachers whose salaries have stagnated, in nurses forced to work double shifts without adequate equipment, in truck drivers crushed by rising costs and decreasing pay. Suddenly, the economic suffering that once seemed confined to one sector feels like a national epidemic. The miners become the first to rise only because they are the first to hit the breaking point, but their courage becomes a signal to others that silence is no longer the safest option. The fictional government's inability to acknowledge this shared hardship only accelerates the spread of unrest. When people feel ignored, they grow frustrated. When they feel dismissed, they grow angry. But when they feel deliberately oppressed, they become fearless. As the inequality widens, another hook emerges, the chilling realization that the government's stability depends on a population willing to tolerate injustice, and that tolerance is evaporating. The state responds with the usual tools of control, minimizing grievances, censoring coverage, deploying police forces to manage crowds. But these tactics backfire because they do not address the root of the unrest, they amplify it. When workers who have lived honest, difficult lives are met with riot shields instead of relief. They do not retreat, they harden. Every bait and strike on a miner's back becomes a symbol of the growing gap between the powerful and the powerless. Every tear gas canister becomes proof that the state sees its own citizens not as partners in national progress, but as obstacles to its authority. And that understanding unleashes a deeper, more unshakable fury. The social fabric in this fictional Russia begins to unravel as inequality becomes impossible to contain. Towns that once depended on mining find themselves stripped of opportunity, while elites in Moscow celebrate economic growth that never reaches the people generating it. The injustice feels personal, intimate, inescapable. Parents struggle to feed their children while watching officials live in guarded luxury. Young adults flee their hometowns, believing their futures have been stolen. Older workers wonder how decades of loyalty could be repaid with abandonment. These emotional fractures spill into the streets, reshaping protest from an economic demand into a moral movement. People are no longer fighting for wages alone. They are fighting to reclaim dignity from a system that treated them as collateral damage. What makes this fictional moment so gripping is the revelation that inequality is not merely a disparity. It is a spark with the power to ignite a nation. When the scales tilt so dramatically that one side feels suffocated under the weight of neglect, the natural response is to push back. And in that push, the miners discover that their struggle is shared, their anger is justified, and their rising voice is louder than the state ever imagined. The miners' uprising becomes the clearest reminder of a truth governments often forget until it's too late. The greatest political force in any nation is not its leadership, its wealth, or its military. It is the people who keep the country running every single day. Workers, especially those performing the most physically demanding and economically essential jobs, carry a power that remains dormant until the moment they decide to use it. And when they do, the shift in national momentum can be seismic. What makes this moment so compelling is the hook buried at its core, the realization that workers who spent their lives underground, unseen and underestimated, are now the ones driving a political reckoning above ground. The miners, whose histories are etched in exhaustion, injury, and resilience, suddenly stand at the center of a movement far larger than themselves. They are not career politicians. They are not trained strategists. They are not revolutionaries in the classic sense. They are ordinary citizens who have grown tired of carrying the weight of a country on their backs while receiving nothing in return but empty promises and eroding livelihoods. And yet, in this fictional crisis, they become the spark that reminds the entire nation of how much political power lies in the hands of labor. The magnitude of their influence becomes visible the moment they step out of the mines and into the streets, not as isolated workers fighting isolated battles, but as a unified force capable of turning economic suffering into political action. Their defiance reveals something governments fear but rarely acknowledge. When the workforce stops moving, the country stops with it. It is not the elites who keep the lights on. It is not the oligarchs who fuel factories or keep trains running. It is not the bureaucrats who dig the coal that powers cities or extract the resources that drive national revenue. It is workers. And when those workers decide that the system no longer deserves their labor, they instantly transform from overlooked citizens into the most consequential political actors on the stage. That radical shift in visibility is what electrifies the fictional movement. Suddenly, the Kremlin's carefully crafted image of control feels brittle compared to the raw, unmistakable strength of thousands of workers marching shoulder to shoulder, refusing to be silent any longer. What deepens the impact of this uprising is how quickly their courage spreads to other sectors of society. In every country, people draw inspiration not from speeches delivered in parliament, but from the bravery of those who look like them, live like them, and struggle like them. When miners, a group historically associated with toughness, endurance, and unglamorous loyalty, stand up, they send an unspoken message to millions of others: if we can resist, so can you. Teachers who spent years coping with dwindling resources feel emboldened. Healthcare workers exhausted by understaffed clinics find their voices. Transportation workers who kept the economy afloat during crisis recognize that they, too, have been undervalued and overburdened. The fictional uprising becomes a chain reaction, each link forged by the shared recognition that workers have far more influence than they have ever been encouraged to believe. This shift dismantles one of the most powerful myths in authoritarian governance, the idea that citizens are powerless unless the state grants them permission to speak. The miners shatter that myth simply by refusing to comply. As their influence grows, the state finds itself confronting a crisis it cannot solve with propaganda, intimidation, or force. Governments can suppress dissent when dissent is scattered. They can silence isolated voices. They can ignore petitions and protests that lack momentum. But they cannot easily crush a movement that forms the backbone of national productivity. This is where the fictional tension tightens. Every attempt to quell the miners' revolt backfires because it overlooks a fundamental truth. The system needs them far more than they need the system. The government can arrest activists, but it cannot arrest an entire workforce. It can censor journalists, but it cannot censor the empty shelves in mining towns. It can deploy troops, but it cannot force citizens to return underground when the mines no longer offer life. Only struggle. The more the state tries to push workers back into submission, the more it exposes its own dependence on the very people it seeks to control. The hook that makes this dynamic so compelling is the simple yet powerful revelation that political systems, no matter how authoritarian, rest on a fragile foundation built from the cooperation of millions of ordinary people. When that cooperation collapses, the illusion of invincibility collapses with it. In this fictional Russia, the miners' decision to reject silence becomes more than a protest. It becomes a national awakening. Their insistence on being heard forces the entire country to recognize that true political power has always been in the hands of those who build, dig, transport, heal, teach, and sustain. They do not need permission to redefine their nation's future. They need only the collective courage to claim the influence they have possessed all along. In this fictional scenario, the uprising of miners and the unraveling stability of the Russian state offer a powerful warning to democracies and governments across the world, highlighting a truth that is as old as political systems themselves. No nation, no matter how advanced or authoritative, can survive when it stops listening to the people whose lives form the fabric of its society. What grips the reader first is the hook embedded in this moment, the realization that this crisis is not just about Russia, not just about miners, not just about economic collapse. It is a mirror held up to every country that believes it is immune to the consequences of neglecting its citizens. History has shown time and again that when governments drift too far from the realities of the people they govern, the distance becomes a vacuum that ordinary citizens fill with resistance. In this imagined Russia, that resistance begins with workers, but the lesson it delivers reverberates far beyond its fictional borders. It becomes a message to democracies that pride themselves on representation, to authoritarian systems that rely on control, and to hybrid states that balance between the two. Ignore the voices of your own people, and they will eventually rise louder than any official narrative you try to impose. What makes this moment particularly compelling is the way it exposes the fragility of political stability when it is built on shallow foundations. Leaders across the world often assume that economic indicators, military strength, or political alliances guarantee their security. But the fictional crisis unfolding in Russia reveals a sobering truth: those markers mean nothing if citizens feel unheard, exploited, or abandoned. The uprising does not begin because foreign actors intervened or because political elites plotted in backrooms. It begins because ordinary people reached the limit of what they were willing to endure. That is the lesson global governments should fear most, not the uprising itself, but the simplicity of its cause. When people lose faith in institutions, institutions lose their legitimacy. And once legitimacy erodes, even minor grievances can transform into national emergencies. Democracies especially must recognize that elections alone are not enough to sustain trust. Representation without responsiveness is just another form of silence. Another hook emerges from the emotional core of this fictional moment, the recognition that economic justice is not merely an economic issue, but a profound political requirement. Nations often underestimate how quickly economic inequality, failing industries, and collapsing livelihoods can metastasize into political unrest. In the imagined Russia, the collapse of the mining industry becomes the trigger for civil revolt. But the deeper message is universal. Economic abandonment, whether in industrial towns in Europe, rural regions in Asia, or inner cities in America, carries the potential to destabilize even the most resilient political systems. When people cannot support their families, no speech from a politician is reassuring. When communities decay, no patriotic slogan can mask the rot. When workers feel betrayed, they stop seeing themselves as contributors to society and start seeing themselves as casualties of it. And governments that fail to understand this lose something far more important than popularity. They lose the confidence of the people, and with it, the foundation of their authority. This fictional scenario also warns that governments often misjudge how quickly despair can transform into solidarity. Leaders tend to assume that citizens will remain fragmented, isolated in their struggles, unwilling to confront power directly. But inequality and suffering have a way of dissolving those boundaries. In the imagined Russia, miners spark a movement that spreads across industries, generations, and regions. That pattern should alarm any government that relies on the assumption that citizens will never unite against them. When the people find common cause, their collective strength overwhelms even the most deeply entrenched systems. Democracies must take note, not because they face the same structures as authoritarian states, but because complacency can be just as dangerous as autocracy. A government that assumes it cannot fall is a government that has already begun to weaken. What makes this fictional portrayal so powerful is its universality. It reveals how quickly a nation can shift when the gap between government and citizen becomes too wide to ignore. It reminds world leaders that power is not sustained by force alone, nor by propaganda, nor by wealth, nor by institutional complexity. Power is sustained by trust, the fragile, irreplaceable belief that citizens hold in the idea that their government is working for them rather than against them. When that trust breaks, even the strongest state becomes vulnerable. And the fictional Russia in this scenario becomes a case study for the world. If a nation ignores the warning signs written in the lives of its own people, the consequences will not be subtle. They will be seismic. As we close tonight, I want to leave you with this thought. Even in a fictional scenario like the one we explored, the echoes of history are not quiet. They reverberate through every generation. When workers rise, when ordinary people refuse to be dismissed or silenced, entire systems can shift beneath their feet. And whether we are looking back at the fall of the Soviet Union or imagining a Russia shaken by its miners, once again, the lesson remains unmistakable. Power ultimately rests with the people who build, who dig, who labor, who keep a nation alive.